call the meeting to order and conducting roll call.
Please call the time for me, Mr. Cooley, please.
The time is 6 o'clock p.m.
Thank you. I can do a roll call. Mayor Carroll?
Here.
Councilmember Santos? Treasurer Sharon Geiser?
Here.
Chair Steve Cooley?
Here.
Vice Chair Richard Beneke?
Here.
Member Stephen Martino?
Here.
Member Joanne Roberts? Member Anna Alvera? And alternate member Andrew Forrester.
Good evening.
That's, I'm wondering. Do we have a quorum, Nicole?
1,
5, right? We need 5.
yes, we do. We have a quorum.
Okay.
All right.
Seeing that we do have a quorum, we'll able to go ahead and hopefully a couple other members will join us shortly. Member Anna Oliveira has asked to be excused, and that's been granted. We,
Okay, thank you. You want to do the pledge?
yep. Can we stand and do the Pledge of Allegiance, please? I
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you.
Nicole,
Yes, ma'am.
if I may, Chair.
Yes.
Andrew is our alternate member.
Yes.
So do we have enough voting members for tonight?
If there is a total
Oh,
of
here's Ray.
Here we go.
Now we do.
So now we do for sure.
less math, all right.
I think we should put on there a check for it, organization at one of these future meetings, just to make sure. We might want to move Andrew forward at some point.
Right.
For clarification, for a quorum, we need 5 voting members, right?
Yes, there are 8 members total.
Right. So we need one plus, 4 plus 1. Okay.
Good.
That's what I thought.
Thank you.
Okay, then we need to discuss the approval of the meetings, the minutes for our last meeting. And that last meeting was conducted when?
June 4th.
June 4th.
Yes.
In July, we did not have adequate members for a quorum, and so we postponed the meeting.
Correct.
So does anybody have any discussion on those minutes, or are they acceptable and correct as appear?
I'll move to approve the minutes.
I'll second.
Is there any votes against that? If not, then we'll go ahead and approve the meetings and go forward. Any conflicts of interest or anything needs to be disclosed?
Well, in terms of the agenda for tonight,
Okay.
I noticed the regular meeting next month is on Labor Day, and I think we probably want to change that.
Why don't we talk at the end of the meeting?
Yeah, let's talk at the end of the meeting about when we should schedule that.
Okay.
And maybe we'll have a couple other people actually move in at that
Want to
point.
make sure before we approve the agenda that it was noted that we don't want to meet on Labor Day.
And that's so noted. Do we have a motion to approve the?
I'll do the motion.
Second.
This is in regards to the,
Agenda?
Yeah.
We really don't probably need
Right,
it.
yeah, no, we don't. Okay.
Okay.
All right, thank you. All right. So let's move on down to the next agenda meeting, and that is the presentation of the draft fiscal year 2017, the auditor's report on the internal controls.
Good evening, committee. We do have a draft copy of the letter that we provided to each of you. It should have been available to you at your seat. And we do have the auditor, Vanessa Burke, who is here to do a presentation, go through the findings and how we've been reported for those. and then we can talk about the management responses if you have any questions after that. So here is Vanessa.
Yes, they're in the back.
Excuse me for just a moment. We do want to,
Are we
to make note that
just going over the
Joanne.
internal control report? Okay, yeah, so, oh, yeah, not the PowerPoint.
We're not
That's the
changing- we're
next
not
item.
changing order.
Yeah. The internal control report doesn't have a PowerPoint.
Oh, I'm sorry. I had it wrong.
Yeah, sorry. I don't want to confuse you.
we'd just like to point out that Ms. Roberts has arrived. We're glad to have you here. Thank you. Okay, turn the time over for your presentation.
All right, good morning, good afternoon, evening, early evening, Mayor and members of the Audit Committee. I'm Vanessa Burke. I'm a partner with the firm of the Poon Group. And is my mic on? Does everybody hear me? It is? Okay, everybody can hear me. So I'm pleased to present to you tonight the draft of the report on internal controls and compliance and other matters identified in our audit for June 30 of 2017. And so you have before you, as an around-the-bench distribution, a letter labeled that with our logo on it. Do you have that? Everybody have that in front of them? Yeah. Yep. Okay, good. So first I'm going to kind of set the framework for our report on internal controls. And I know I've been before most of you previously. We've talked a little bit about what we do with internal controls as part of our audit. But I just want to reemphasize that as the independent auditors, our consideration of your internal controls as an agency is limited for purposes of designing our audit procedures and not for purposes of expressing an opinion on the operating effectiveness of your internal controls. In addition, we possibly would not identify all errors or all weaknesses in internal control that might exist within the city as part of that process, because we're doing it for purposes of designing our audit plan and coming up with how we're going to audit the city. And that is not a requirement of the standards. However, if we do come upon something and we identify what we would define as a significant deficiency or a material weakness, which I described to you in a previous meeting, then those we are required to bring to your attention under Statement on Auditing Standards number 115. That is a letter that you have in front of you. So the standards under which we report to you is Statement on Auditing Standards number 115. You're not a public company. We do not report to you internal control operating effectiveness like a publicly traded company, if that makes sense. So what we typically do is we categorize our reportable conditions into two categories: material weaknesses and significant deficiencies. And just for purpose of emphasis, material weaknesses are a deficiency, one, or a combination of deficiencies such that a material error could occur in your financial statements and go undetected and not be corrected timely, which means by the end of your audit, that audit error was not corrected. A significant deficiency is also a deficiency of one or a combination of deficiencies in the internal control structure that, in our judgment, are less severe than a material weakness, because materiality is a judgment in the audit, but that we believe merits your attention. And when you look at the opinion that we've rendered, it describes those two categories. Now, we've also reported to you what we consider other matters, and we're allowed to report to you other matters. And those are not required to be reported in writing, but we put them in the letter if we believe that they rise to a level that it warrants your attention, but it could help improve the operations of the city. Again, it's not necessarily a significant deficiency or a material weakness in your internal control. And then together, we put those all in one report. Now, one of the things to think about in this report is that the last that the city received their report on internal controls was January of 2018. So your 2016 control environment that was audited and the findings that came to your attention in a writing in January of 2018, which means the audit year that we're reporting on, June 30 of 17, had already passed. Internal controls are a process that occurs during the fiscal year. So when you're testing for the design and the adequate design and whether a city has implemented internal controls, you have to look at it during the period in which it's operating. So the period of our review is through July 1 of 2016 through June 30 of 2017. And that's important in context because many of the findings that are in this report were reported to you, but there was no time frame within which staff or management or you as city council could have necessarily taken action and resolved those findings. Now, that doesn't mean that they weren't already being worked on and there are changes from last year's report, but for purposes of our audit, when we come in and look at the city, you didn't have adequate time to help improve your internal control structure. So that means we have to take a different approach in our design of your audit. That's what we look at when we look at internal controls. So to kind of put a little more context in this, I think if you just turn to the table of contents, what I'd like to do is walk you through last year's comments. And I gave you a status of prior year. And the reason I did that, that's not a requirement, but I thought it would be informative to you as the Audit and Finance Committee to understand where staff focused their attention from January of 18, and we were here shortly thereafter. In order to get it implemented. So either things were implemented by the time we got here to begin our audit of 17 or they weren't, right? And they had partially been worked on or not. So we'll talk about what I did is I shortened the findings and the status of prior year. So the only thing that is included in this report is the recommendation from last year's auditors from the prior firm and then the status of management's corrective action, because technically management has the corrective action and they're required to implement what they say they told you last year in the report. So we looked at what their corrective action was and we got an update on that so that we could report that back to you. So if you looked at finding 2016-001, policies and procedures, we believe that finding has somewhat been partially implemented. And that was a complicated finding because it was related to policies and procedures, and there were about 3 or 4 things in there. It's almost like looking at a recipe, right? You got 3 or 4 things in there, but when you look at each step separately, it's a little easier to identify. So as you know, the accounting policies and procedures, you had started working on those, but they really hadn't been adopted until January of 2018. And that is after the audit period of June 30 of 2017. So I know you're partially implementing them, but you hadn't fully implemented them by the period of our audit of June 30, 2017. So we don't take that finding out. We're going to repeat that finding in the current year. All right. The next one, the level of unrestricted fund balance in the general fund, we believe that was implemented as part of your policy setting for your budget for 16-17. So we know, and this is on page 19, we know that you have at least established a reserve level, and obviously more formal policies are happening. Now, have you achieved that reserve level? At this point in time, we did not test that because you didn't have enough time to build up your reserves to see if you've actually met your targeted reserve. The debt management policy, as you know, a formal debt management policy was adopted as part of your financial management policies in January of 2018. Again, that's after the end of the audit period. So we can't take credit for it in the June 30, 2017 audit. The fourth part of that finding last year was fraud prevention and detection. It was partially implemented, but not implemented during our audit period. And though you had instituted some fraud training programs during the year before the end of the fiscal year, and we looked at some of those, in our interviews of staff, some employees were still unaware of the policy during our interview, which means that what you had done to date did not resonate through the city. And so I feel strongly that with past events at the city that a fraud prevention program, a full fraud prevention program and risk assessment shouldn't really be embedded as part of your accounting policy. So we've split that out separately in 2017 as finding 2017-003. It really needs to be not only tone at the top training, but it really needs to be part of the fiber of the city. And I know that everybody's making strides and it's there, but we want to be able to go through your organization and everybody know exactly if a fraud was identified, who do they go to, who do they report it to, what avenues they have. And that's critical for you and your oversight of the financials for the organization so that you know that you're getting information direct and that you're going to have a process in which to investigate those claims. And it can include the police department and a variety of sources. I think last year, the way that finding was written, they basically said, yeah, you should have a fraud policy and you could see us for more details. But, really, it's something that I know you've adopted internal audit money in the budget for this fiscal year. Fraud program and policy would probably be a high priority in my mind. Capital assets was the other area of policies and procedures, and we have implemented the fixed asset policies and the capital improvement policies. Those were adopted in September of 16. Obviously, a lot of work has gone into the citywide street assessment, asset tagging, inventory, and data from that was all used for purposes of capitalizing the fixed assets for June 30th of 2017, which resulted in getting the city in conformity with GAAP. So we did not repeat that portion of that finding. So you can kind of get a flavor for how we're reporting these findings out to you. So what I'm going to do is quickly kind of go down the prior year findings in the table of contents. The accounting and financial reporting is partially implemented. There are some policies and procedures and some closing processes that we would like to see occurring. We've reported that to you in finding 2017-1, and again, 2017-2 is repeated. Segregation of duties for cash receipts at City Hall. That has been partially implemented. You do have some system limitations that are preventing you currently from the void credit process being an automated process. And so they're looking at system changes for that, and you'll see in the new system, now that you've got that together, to actually expand really your application control procedures. But we believe, after looking at that, that there needs to be more monitoring and edit check reports that are generated on the voids and any credits given against the accounts on a central level. Segregation of duties at the police department. As you know, this was a, and I should talk a little bit about the classification. We've changed the classification on some of these. The prior auditor may have deemed it to be a material weakness, but when we evaluated, for example, the segregation of duties at the police department, which was for after hours cash collection of fees by by a few people in a small receipt book, we don't believe over a period of time that could ever rise, even if there was a defalcation, to a material amount to your overall financial statements. So what we've done is we've actually reclassified that to an other matter. Does that make sense? Because it would take years and years and years for that to grow to a material amount to your general fund.
What do you define as a material amount? You said a dollar amount?
Yeah, dollar threshold.
We do.
And that is?
We set a dollar threshold. We don't like to give it out because we set it. We have our standard process to set the materiality amount. We don't like to give it out publicly necessarily because then everybody knows what our materiality is. So, for example, if I told you our materiality was $50,000, and everybody would, then everybody in the city who's watching the TV would, use procurement, and they would split their purchases down to $50,000 or less. But it's typically a level in which in our judgment, what materiality is defined as is that a stakeholder or a user of that financial statement, in looking at the financial statement, would make a different decision or come to a different conclusion than they would have had they known that information existed. Is that clear? So in our judgment, we deem that to, and we do it by reporting units. So we do it for government-wide, we do it at the fund level. Okay?
Sorry to interrupt. So I'm guessing in this, just for clarification, this is looking at things like the fix-it tickets of like $10 fines and things like that. We're not talking about like huge, massive fines levied on people.
Yeah, I doubt after hours people are coming in to pay their fix-it tickets, but
They
I don't
can't.
know.
After hours, it's mostly for people who need to get their cars out of the tow yard.
Oh, okay.
And that's really all that it is at the police department. So it's not every day, and it's not a tremendous amount, but that's
it's
what's
very low volume,
collected.
very
Right,
low
that's
value.
collected after hours.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that.
yeah. So again, we're looking at the total revenue that the city collects overall from that program when we're making our materiality decision. The other 2016-05 was segregation of duties at the community pool. And if you looked at last year's finding, essentially they indicated that they ran out of tape in order to reconcile the daily cash drawer. And in my mind, the key control is the daily reconciliation. So the question becomes, was it an anomaly? You had one day, or do you have multiple days where there's no supplies out there? So we believe you've sufficiently placed tape out there. We do recommend that the city look at other ways in which to avoid that from happening in the remote locations. And I think one of the other adds to this year's findings, for example, for the police department and the community pool and for bus passes, is that the policy itself is really, the way it's written today, is driven towards the central cashiering, but it should expand into remote locations. You've got, other parking, libraries, et cetera. So in our mind, that community pool is effectively implemented, and when we come back this year for 17-18 to test, what we would focus on, now that you're saying you've implemented, is whether or not those daily reconciliations, the key control is the word reconciliation, right? Reconciliation, authorization, segregation of duties. The next business licenses, that was not implemented, and so we're looking for improvement this year. We repeated that finding. Bus passes was partially implemented last year. It was implemented centrally, but the transit department had not gotten through its process to implement what was recommended last year, was an accounting for the sequences of the bus passes. And what we would like to see in this year's finding, which if you look at it, is that there's a reconciliation between the sequential number and the cash paid, and that you've got a number count reconciled on a regular basis to the cash that's coming in times whatever the value is for that bus pass. And then I know they've put in some color coding so that the monthly bus passes are all color-coded so that you can't use one in 1 month for another month, which could essentially be stealing. Transit occupancy tax and utility user tax, that was partially implemented. In last year's finding, what you will find is the key thing, again, comes back to reconciliation. And you had done them up through a period of time in 2015, and somehow with all of the crisis that had happened, that got dropped. And so the part that got picked up again this year was really the reconciliations restarted, and you are tracking and you are monitoring the TOTs being paid and collected, as well as the utility user tax. TOT, you have 4 hotels, again, looking at materiality. This year, we actually made that a significant deficiency. You would have to have all 4 hotels not pay you for a long period of time for it to rise to a level that would be material overall to the financial statements. But we do believe that that reconciliation ought to occur on a regular basis. 2016-10 development impact fees was partially implemented. As you know, there was a counting that was done over all of the development impact fees and a restart of the beginning balances as of 2016-17. The processes for accounting for the development impact fees are still manual. They are still in Excel spreadsheets, and they are still manual journal entries that are going into your system. They're mapped by fee type, and they are included in a restricted fund, whereas in prior years, all the development impact fees were all commingled into one account. So the breaking out process has occurred, but I would be remiss to not tell you that a manual process is generally prone to error, manipulation, and that that the process that management is going to implement is an automated process where that actually flows through the general ledger directly and not being done on Excel spreadsheets. So we would reiterate again in our finding, and I believe with the size of the fees that are coming into the city being so substantial, that could rise to there could be a weakness in control, that you could have an error in there and it go undetected. Excel spreadsheets are great, accountants love them, but it's not the best accounting source document.
So we're moving in the direction of automating all this?
Yeah.
Basically, is that what you're telling me?
And the cash receipts now are part of the implementation. It is, the cash receipt part is coming through. It's the splitting correctly that isn't always coming through because the softwares didn't talk fully for the entire year. So we monthly then went back to all the permits that were collected, made sure that the total of everything we found paperwork matched the amount of the deposits for the month, but then we had to allocate them all to the correct developer impact fee funds because not all of them were getting picked up. We've since corrected that. Now they are going through. We're still doing the monthly reconciliation, but it's to make sure that it posted everything to the right funds.
And that's not uncommon to run the parallel systems so that you can make sure that you have caught everything when it gets started.
That's correct. So you can run, so for example, let's say your development impact fees are being, plan checks, handling all that. And you can have accounting run secondary monitoring reports. The issue becomes if it's all being done in Excel.
That's right.
The recording and then their posting, then there's no check and balance in the system that can capture, no application control is what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a system application control that prevents that from being posted, right? So that fee goes in for $150, the person pays $150, it goes in for $150, there's no allocation that's being done on a spreadsheet. You just have, it isn't that it's not being done, it's that you have a weakness in the control structure such that because it's a manual process, an error could occur and go undetected. There are simple things. Somebody could hide a row. I've seen this in Excel spreadsheets. They hide a row and they put the font in white. Yep. It still foots, but the row is hidden and the cash is stolen. Okay? So as simple as that, and a lot of people there are a lot of ways to commit fraud. And so going back to the fraud program and your risk assessment, I would think that your development impact fees would rise to a level high on your fraud risk assessment. And therefore, you want to focus your design of your internal controls around those areas where you have the highest level of risk for fraud.
I'm going to assume that this was is being solved with the IT revamp that everyone's going through, so that now it is unnecessary for everything to be done manually, and it will be shifted over.
It has been.
It has been.
The manual process is the double check of the system at this point.
Thank you.
Right.
Yeah, I think what we need to remember here is that this is for a period ended June 30th, 2017.
It's
Yes.
just so I understand
So,
the history
yes.
behind the results.
Right.
Yes, and I'm looking back to 16 because for 17, you got this letter in 18, you had no time to correct, but things were being done. Corrections were being made, staff was working to try to move the city forward towards a stronger internal control environment. And I believe that's going to be a continuous process. You're not going to hit an end game and go, my internal controls are perfect today. It doesn't work like that because people change, systems change, and processes change. You're going to get a new transaction. You're going to have a new program. It's a continuous process of looking at risk to the organization, risk of fraud, risk of error to your financial statements, and it has to be on an ongoing basis. And this committee is really the one with that oversight to ensure that that happens, as well as management, because really you're the ones that are responsible for designing appropriate internal controls. As your auditor, what I can do is I can bring to your attention those things that came to our attention that we think you've got areas of risk and the controls aren't operating or aren't designed as strong as we'd like. The Excel spreadsheet, in my mind and my opinion, is not a strong control over a program where you've got, you know, 4.8 million coming in one fund and another 4.8 million in another fund. It's a large number for the city of this size. And so automatically materiality, it goes to the top of my list. So that's really the judgment of the auditor. And again, I just think that that's an area where you want to focus your priorities because you have a lot to get done, right? You're not going to get it all done today, but you have a lot to get done and accomplished, and staff is limited and resources are limited. So you've got to prioritize which ones are the highest on that list. And I don't do that. That's you, and management does that with the committee. Finding 2016-11, lack of competitive bidding for vendor contracts and purchases. That was a problem in the past. That has been implemented. We did test that this year. We did not see a problem with vendor contracts and purchasing. Lack of controls over payroll. That was implemented last year. And if you look at the 16-12 finding, it talks about levels of review that have been put in place to review payroll that is getting processed through the organization. And you know, payroll costs are one of the largest costs of the organization. So having an independent review being done on that is a secondary monitoring control before the payroll goes in. And that's important to have in place. So I think they focused on, you know, the area where you had strongest weaknesses. 80% of the budget is going out for payroll. It was important for her to focus on that and the city in the last year. Lack of controls over accrued vacation. That we had excess vacations, we had problems with the calculations, we had nobody reviewing them. That's what happened in the past. Subsequent to year end, our year end of our audit process was improved and implemented. And so it was done during our year, but we're looking at accrued vacation at a point in time at June 30th, 17. So we didn't see a problem with the balances at that date. Lack of oversight for fuel credit card activity. That was actually a material weakness in last year. I have repeated that finding for the fuel credit card activity as a significant deficiency. Again, the credit cards, you've got to look at the total volume on the credit cards to see if it's material overall to the city across all funds because you're using that for fleet. There's a card assigned and they put in controls, but they weren't in place for the full year, so we couldn't test it. We will be testing those where they've been partially implemented last year and fully implemented in 17, 18. We're going to do a look back and we're going to test those specific controls to ensure either the control was properly designed and has been implemented or it hasn't been. So if management's telling you they've implemented it, our process in 17, 18 is going to say, was it properly designed and did they implement it? Meaning implement it for the whole period. So it can't be last quarter or third quarter. It's got to be for all quarters of the year. Overhead cost allocation was not implemented. As you're aware under, maybe you're not because you don't have federal funding, but uniform guidance was issued, and overhead cost allocation really is important not only from an internal cost allocation standpoint, but if you get federal funding and you're charging it through for federal grants, that you have an approved indirect cost overhead plan. Currently, you have a one that was done by a consultant. The uniform guidance for federal, just so you know, has a de minimis 10% under the new guidance. You could use that, but you need to be consistent if you use it. So you can't go 10% one year and then say, hey, I'm going to prepare a new plan this year and I'm going to go to 14 or 15 or 16. And so you could always default. You could always default to 10%, but you're kind of stuck with that rate from consistency standpoint. For the current year, the only really, besides expanding on some of those comments, The area that we put in here is really just kind of an overall broad 2017 one comment over internal control over financial reporting, the accounting close, and the accuracy of financial reporting. And obviously, there's a lot of findings related to various areas here, but we had material errors when we came in the financial statements post-close in order to get the books and records up to date, including fixed assets, including pension adjustments, several other adjustments that were previously reported to you in the SAS 114 letter. So typically, we like to see none. There should be none. So our finding here is really recommending that you take a look back and you say, what are those areas where either they were subject to significant judgment or estimate. We had several reports that didn't match the actual report, that we get the timing set up as part of the accounting close before the auditors get here, before we arrive, and get those audit adjustments posted to the books so that we're auditing and we're not having to post all these entries. We should see those numbers, and I know they've diminished substantially, but and staff has done a great job, but we'd like to see the closing checklists for year end encompass those areas where we found errors in the prior year. And so with that, that concludes
Can you hold it down just a little, please?
Go ahead.
So that concludes kind of my prepared remarks, and I'm kind of walking you through the letter. This is draft. The responses in here are management's responses in draft form. And obviously, we can take your input through this up, until we want to issue it in final form if we need to expand on it. But I think you're comfortable and we're comfortable with management's responses in here. There's no disagreement between management and our findings. Usually if there is, that would be something that we would work out before we bring it to your attention. Yeah.
So then just for clarification, this is a draft. It is not a final.
Yes.
The draft will be reviewed and a final will be issued at a later date. And we're not sure exactly when that date is, correct? We would expect to have that by our next meeting.
Yeah, I could final it. I would be comfortable finaling it tonight, absent any added input. I know you've done a lot of work on policy and procedure in the last year. So keeping in mind timing, right? So the issue is that if the audit committee reviews this and takes it up at its next meeting and wants me to incorporate some statement about a policy you've implemented and a response that we didn't capture, we could still put that in as long as you wanted us to include that in the final report to reflect the record that management has done certain things related to those findings. So that would be what we would ask you as audit committee to do, is review those responses, maybe at your next meeting, come up with any adds or additions to the letter that need to be included from the standpoint of all the work that you've done in the last year. And we try to incorporate as much as possible, but there may be something that
Correct.
Strikes one of you as significant for public distribution.
Correct. So anybody on our committee have any comments, or are we comfortable as a committee with passing this draft on to the council?
Could I make a recommendation?
Surely.
Okay. I have some questions and some comments, and I don't know if other committee members do, but my suggestion is that we open public comments on this particular agenda item, take any public comments, and then come back with any deeper questions that any of us have on this. And our role tonight, as I understand it, is we are a committee that either can recommend this to council with whatever modifications maybe that we have under discussion, or we don't recommend it to council because it needs something substantial. So with that, we don't actually pass the audit. We actually make the recommendation. We're a service committee of council. to make that recommendation or to make whatever based on our discussion changes that we feel might need to be woven in or discussed with you and considered by you. So with that, I would like to see some public comments if there are any. And then go to
Has this been
discussion.
out, has this been out into the public long enough for people to have an opportunity to review it and make comments on it? Has it been out long enough?
Hasn't been posted at all?
No, it has
How
not.
can we have
We
no
did it around
comments
the
if it
bench
hasn't-
distribution for this meeting.
They didn't
Yeah.
post it online, they didn't
Yeah.
release it ahead.
Well, it really,
You're asking for public comments?
it's probably, how many pages do we have? 21 pages.
It's the
Some of
same as
those
it's
are
been
table
last
of
few years
content.
we've
Some of
I
those
understand.
are the
I
cover
understand.
pages, and
That's-
they were being
I understand.
read. So I would still like to be able, we do have public hearing, I'd like to be able to open it to public comment. So you're not against opening it to public comments, are you?
I'm never opposed to opening things to public comment as long as the public has an opportunity to review. I personally don't feel comfortable. I know we got this, I got it late Friday, and I looked it over, but I now I've had the presentation, now I'd feel more comfortable. We can go ahead and have public comment, but from my standpoint, I'd like to take another look at this. I'd like to bring it back at our next meeting. This is one of there are very few things as a Finance and Audit Committee that we really have a lot to do with. I mean, we have a lot. I mean, I'm not dismissing what we do, but this is very important. I mean, there are controls here, there are things that have been implemented, they're halfway there, they're 3/4 of the way there. We as a committee need to be very familiar with what's going on in this document and feel very comfortable that we're progressing in the right direction. That's all I'm saying. And right now, I don't have that comfort level. I'm sorry, Nancy, I don't have that
I
comfort.
didn't ask you to approve it tonight. I said it was open for discussion.
Well,
tonight.
I'm discussing it, I'm
Part of
discussing
the
it.
discussion may, but I think we need to hear anybody else's question too.
That's fine, that's
from the
fine.
committee.
I have no problem with that.
And I think we should go through that process, and certainly at the end of that process, if that certainly is the way that you feel, you may end up getting the same sentiment from somebody else on this committee. But I'd like us to go through the same orderly process we go through, which is to open it up to public comments, which is what a public meeting is required to do.
Absolutely,
And is to
absolutely.
also allow everybody else to ask their questions.
Yeah, but I don't
And to
want
tell
this to serve as the final public comment period. This would be
You're-
fine to do
you
it
have to be
today,
heard.
but if we bring this back next,
You've been heard.
Okay.
yes,
Thank you.
okay.
So at this point in time, let's do that. Do we have any public here that would like
Do
to
we have any
comment?
requests?
We have any
Yes, we do.
requests?
We skipped over initial public comment. I think that was my error on the,
Well,
on the
yes, we were going to
agenda.
move to
No,
that next,
It's
but
only
Yeah.
important that we do it,
Yeah.
not the order.
it jumped to the bottom for whatever reason. Libby, did you want to speak?
I brought in a pamphlet for everybody in the audit committee. Did you guys get that pamphlet? Ma'am, did you get about 5 or 6 pages?
No, it's all here. It would go in their mailboxes after.
No, you want to have it right now. There we go.
You can just pass it down. Would you just pass it down?
I'll take care of it.
Mr. Beneke, would you take it? Thank you.
What you have there is emails from the City of Beaumont staff and Urban Future staff, January 2016, which included Mike Bush and Vanessa Burke. Vanessa Burke was your financial advisor for 5 days before she jumped over to the PUN group to audit the financial statements that she forged. SEC federal law, Section 303, improper influence of conduct of audits. It shall be unlawful for any officer, director, or of the issuer, or any person acting under the direction thereof, to take any action to fraudulently influence, coerce, manipulate, mislead the financial statements of that issuer for the purpose of rendering such financial statements material misleading. She forged your audit. Your internal controls report is basically the same as that's been for the last 2 years. I told you people 3 years ago, you need a finance director, not Milana Taylor. She's not qualified. She's never been a finance director. She has no experience in government books, and she's not bright enough to be a finance director. And you need 3 more accountants. You need 4 accountants. Did you notice your internal controls audit doesn't say you throw all your money in the general fund? You can talk about your development impact fees all you want, but as long as that money is thrown into the general fund and then thrown to lawyers and consultants, you are not doing your books properly. The sewer fund is an enterprise fund. It should have a specific separate account. That money is thrown into the general fund. Your fire station money should go into a specific fund. That money is thrown into the general fund. All of the money is thrown into the general fund. Don't tell me you got an internal controls audit. It's the same as the last 3 years, so you shouldn't have no trouble looking over it. This is a fraud, and you all know it's a fraud. So don't tell me you're grown-ups, you're adults, you act like it. You have a responsibility here. This is a federal requirement, this committee. You are not here to play games. This is not a joke. You are fraudulently approving for corrupt financial statements, and you know it. Talk amongst yourselves.
Any other comments?
Not that I have.
You can't,
Okay.
you can't respond to public comments.
Correct. All right.
That wasn't a public comment, it was a comment on the agenda item.
Well, since we didn't open with public comments, it was really not clear which one that was.
Okay.
Do we need to have clarification that that was an agendaized comment? You feel free, Mayor Nancy
You've had your
Carroll,
time.
who has fraudulently hired auditors over and over.
All right, this is an organized public meeting. It is not your private meeting. Please stop screaming. Thank you.
I'm not screaming.
You've had your time. We have heard what you had to say.
So go ahead and you talk now.
All right, let's move along.
Let's move on.
Let's not slip down into the...
We did not have a copy of this report before tonight,
No, we did not.
We did not.
so
We
we
didn't.
haven't really had time
I know.
to digest it.
You can still address any questions to the PUN group. So just the fact that you were given it now and the fact that the PUN group went through a number of items, I know that it certainly did pique some questions in my mind, but the issue of whether there is enough time to move on it certainly is a valid one. And I would encourage anybody who feels that way to make sure that you bring that up before we wrap up this agenda item. So thank you, Sharon, for bringing that up. All right. Excuse me, Vanessa, I do have some questions for you, if I could, please. So it seems to me that one of the things that carried over into a number of different areas seemed to be reconciliation, reconciliation, reconciliation. And even if we did reconcile, it just was not timely enough. And it seemed to cross over when you talked about the, community services and the pool, and you talked about the police department. And so it seemed like the timeliness of the reconciliation seemed to be a systemic process that we needed to address.
Yeah.
Is that a fair statement based on what you were covering when you hit on the different areas?
Yeah, and I do think that one of the key internal controls in any organization is segregation of duties. And so, you need to segregate the receipting process from the custody, from the recording, okay? Those are the 3 areas that you would ideally in any strong control environment have those segregated. And then even before that is authorization. Let's say you're getting a new employee, you're receiving a new employee, that it's authorized in advance, right? So those are kind of some of the key controls: segregation of duties, authorization, evidence, documentation, reconciliation, and then again monitoring controls. So monitoring of budget versus actual. That can even occur in the system itself, meaning you've got a trigger in your system that won't let an expenditure go through, and if there's a budget limit on it and it kicks out, right? Those are all controls, and they can be designed. You can design your control structure in a number of ways, but I think here, because it's a smaller city and it's grown very rapidly, the segregation of duties over time had been a problem, as well as you had collusion going on and fraud that was occurring within the organization amongst a small group of people, and did not allow or build a structure such that it had a strong system of internal controls. They didn't want to get caught, right? We all know that. That's all history. It's in the past, but that's what you've inherited as a committee. That's what management has inherited. And now what's important is to really get a really strong understanding of internal controls and build those in place. So where you see me pointing out things like segregation of duties or reconciliation, it's because there isn't adequate enough people to segregate all the duties necessarily. So you have to build the reconciliation process and that monitoring level in place. But we only have one director of finance, so there's only one of her to be able to look at all of those transactions. If you read the fraud finding that I put in here, one of the important things that I put in it, in my mind, was that really the prevention of fraud and problems from occurring is everyone's responsibility in the city. It isn't just yours. It isn't just Milana's. It isn't just us as the auditors. It's everyone in the city that is assigned a duty for the custody and care of the city's and the citizens' numbers, right? The tax numbers that come in, the revenue dollars, the fees that citizens are paying, homeowners are paying. It's everybody's duty as part of their assignment in their job description to be a part of that process. And that's why I elevated the fraud program and the risk assessment of fraud much higher than probably the prior auditor did, just having seen this evolve over time. And so really, yes, when you start focusing on fraud and where frauds can occur and where it keeps you up at night, and where things can happen, that reconciliation process is essentially preventive control or detective control, right? So you have two kinds of controls, preventive or detective. Preventive can happen from a system stopping it so you can't spend the money. Detective means we're going to do the reconciliation after the fact and we're going to catch it, but that doesn't mean you caught it in time, so the fraud already occurs. So it's already happened, but we detected it later. So you really want to focus on preventive and detective. Segregation of duties would be a preventive control, right? So you're segregating those three areas of that process, and it takes a lot of time to go through every one of your business cycles to determine where the right controls should be in that system. And there are consultants that do this time and again. You spend hundreds of thousands of dollars. Publicly traded companies spent billions of dollars trying to get this put into place. And we see it coming down from PCOB more into the governmental arena now, and you really are responsible for building a strong set of internal controls. So I do think, and I can't emphasize enough, we all get busy in our day-to-day operations of the city, and the controls and the policies and procedures kind of fall to the wayside. And it really needs to be higher up.
Okay.
I have another question, but I don't want to be the only one that asks questions. And Andrew, I cut you off earlier. Did you have comments? I'm sorry.
No, with that, mine's more of a misunderstanding of the procedures in which we're dealing with these topics. So there's some that I'll just leave to the end. I'm fine, but I appreciate you coming back to these things.
So we put in place some fraud policies, but when I was listening to you explain how you looked into this and how you want to raise this up, what I heard you say was not everybody's aware of what to do and, what the response is and, what the policy is.
Correct.
So that to me means that it needs to have a significant training and awareness element added to the written policies. Because if we had had that in place, then when you talk to people, it would have been very clear to them. Not only is there a policy, but what it is that they need to do. So would you say that's sort of the other shoe
Yeah.
that needs to drop?
Yeah, if you look at the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations, which is COSO, they built an integrated framework for internal controls. And that really is what drives the intro. It's a cube. Everybody's probably seen it. And I know a lot of you have a financial background. But it talks about control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information, and communication. So you may put in the best policies in the world, but if it doesn't get communicated through the organization, then that means that those policies can be ineffective in their operation. Now, we're not testing for operating effectiveness as part of our audit, but it's something for you to be aware of, that cube is built such that you're looking at your overall control environment tone at the top, and that's on page 3 if you want to look at it. And then monitoring consists of those activities that you establish to assess the performance, and it's over time, meaning for the whole period of the audit, right? It's not just, I put the control in place today at Q4, quarter 4, that I can't rely on that as an auditor. If I was to come back and you said, Vanessa, come back and test our operating effectiveness, I would tell you today I could not do it. I would probably tell you in 17, 18, certain cycles I couldn't do it. And overall internal controls over financial reporting, I don't know if we'll get all these done by 17, 18. My gut feeling is we probably won't get through, the city won't get through all of those by the end of 17, 18.
So what I'm understanding is that when you did your test, it was time period specific, and you're aware that some, if not all, of these activities have occurred, but you're not testing for that in this audit, but you still believe that there's probably other things that could be done to improve and make this so that at one of your audits, those won't become issues.
Absolutely.
Is that what I'm hearing?
That is exactly what I'm saying.
And I believe that's what's reflected in
Yeah.
here, but I just wanted to clarify that. And I think that
Well,
capsulizes the whole thing.
Yeah, I agree with Nancy. I think, I mean, it's one thing to say we need this, but in your review, some of the people apparently working here have not had that information. So how do we get from step A to step B where we make sure that these people get the information? I mean, do we put something in a policy somewhere that directs somebody to do something, or, I mean, where do we go? I mean,
That's exactly what we are supposed to be doing tonight.
Right.
We're supposed to, and maybe in a secondary meeting also, but we are supposed to be doing the best that we can to say whatever it is that needs to be added to strengthen going forward. So, and I certainly did hear you on saying about the restricted time that we've had to go over.
Right.
We may make a recommendation at some point to council to accept the audit based on our discussions, such as we would like there to be a recommendation put in there on a training and awareness program for fraud. We'd like there to be strengthened emphasis on segregation of duties and reconciliations happening faster. I mean, those are all things that we can have this conversation with the PUN group and say that these are added value that we can put on this, because the council doesn't always, during the council meeting, have the time to go into the level of discussion that we do. And that's really our purpose, is to ferret out what it is that we think needs to be stated stronger, what it is that maybe we're not clear on as the report goes forward, and all of those things are truly what we're supposed to be doing. So anything that you need clarification on, ask, and then I think we should discuss whether this needs to come back to another meeting.
okay,
I think some things have been identified.
right.
And we're aware of a number of procedures and stuff that have been implemented, many of them at our request. And our auditors now pointed out some places where it's not quite nailed down. And I think our question before us now is, where do we feel like we are? Do we need to get more or a different clarification from our auditors? And look at it at that point in time. Are we to the point of we believe the draft covers what happened or what was the situation during this audit period? And do we accept that? Do we pass that on for the city council, or do we want to look deeper at this, or where are we at? And that's got to come back from the members of the committee.
Right, okay, so if I'm understanding this correctly, we now have been presented the findings, are pretty very thorough findings here. I perceive our job now to be, and I don't know if you all agree with me, we now need to, in essence, kind of prioritize where we feel some of the really important things are in this document. And is this time sensitive in the sense we have to have it done by September 1st or October 10th or whatever? Or, I mean, what's the sensitivity in terms of approval?
So I could talk a little bit about having been a CFO in a large city. When you receive findings, staff needs a few things: resources, which is money, and those are competing for other areas, and staffing to help implement it. So things like system implementations can be very costly and expensive, and council may always want them. And they say they want them, and they want them in a time frame, but you've got to plan for it. And so what you said about the prioritization, I think, is important. I think the ongoing communication between the audit committee and staff on the status of the findings on an ongoing basis, regular basis, every meeting you come back, because you're meeting very often, and you're talking about the status of those findings and the progress that's being made against them, is really critical in order to get the corrective action put into place. But staff needs to know what they need to work on first, because they're limited on what they're doing, right? You're doing all kinds of things with current operations, but the issue becomes, our focus of our audit is controls over financial reporting. That's it. Is there a material error in the financial statements that your design is so weak? We've somewhat prioritized them for you in the table of contents, right? Your top 7 items are your material weaknesses. I would put those high on your priority list. And, you know, the missing tape at the pools, probably not as big of a problem, but it could turn into a big issue. And so I can't prioritize it for you, but I can tell you these are really the core areas as material weaknesses that I believe should be the focus of implementation of the internal controls. One, because the numbers that are flowing through the city's financials are significant. So that automatically rises to a high level because of the dollar amount. And often when you have a high volume of transactions and low dollars, but it's material, there's risk of error there as well, right? Versus just a few transactions of large dollar amounts. Those are easy to find, like property taxes. It gets paid 2 to 3 times a year. I know that number. Sales taxes, I can confirm it with the state. UUT, you have 4 hotels. That's probably pretty straightforward, or TOT, 4 hotels. UUT, utility user charges, those come in from an independent third party, probably not high risk, but high dollars. So again, I think you've got to go as a committee through the prioritization process with management, and that may need a special study session and something you want to do separately, don't know, or a study session of council.
Here's my input. It appears to me that these have been identified for us. It's come out in this letter. We know what they are. I think what we need is some input back from staff as to where staff is seeing these and what's being done to remedy these issues, put the appropriate controls in, and what they will do or what staff believe needs to be done to where the problems are resolved as far as they possibly can be. I don't think that it's going to benefit us a whole lot to hold this letter while we get that information. We know what it is. Staff knows what it is, and I think we're at the point now that our responsibility is to move forward so that these don't appear in future audits.
And remember, June of 18 has already come and gone, right? So
Correct.
we're already so that year is, the processes and the policies that are there are already in place, whatever was there.
Well, we already have staff reporting to us, on various items. But I think in terms of this document, we may want to prioritize what we want staff reporting to us on.
Okay?
I don't know.
I'm going to make a suggestion, because many of us were on this committee when we were addressing the state controller's office findings. And what we did is we took that report, and then we took the findings, and we basically created a project plan from those findings with anticipated deadlines that we hope to have it completed. So in my mind, there's, if we're generally comfortable with both the audit that we've already seen and then this internal control addition, then we could say at the next Finance and Audit Committee meeting, just for example, that we would like our finance director to come back with us with the top seven project priorities, so that the next audit certainly does go better and every one of these things is addressed. And we could ask the finance director to come back with that in the same type of a project plan that we did the state controller's findings. And then we could do exactly what Vanessa has suggested, which is then track that and track the progress and get reported on a regular basis, so that these things do have the proper prioritization based on how material they are and how much the organization is at risk. And then we can also be a part of constructing an application and implementation process to making sure that that's followed through.
Thank you. You clarified what I thought I was saying.
And
So
then Councilmember Santos
that's,
also had a comment.
that's what I'd like to see.
Yeah. Thank you. On the reviewing this, I'm comfortable on this. I mean, looking at it, and then, looking at, what we discuss, you discuss, is the segregation and reconciliation, okay? And from the day one I got involved in this, I mean, that's the thing that I really emphasize, is the segregation of any account, any, duties and everything in there, and then reconcile, if possible. If we could reconcile daily, that would be great, okay? And I don't have problem with that. The only weakness that I could see in here is the, the biggest one is the spreadsheet. And, my questions to you and to Malana, when we're going to be fully automated, is it will be reflected on the 17-18, or when? I mean, that's the main concern I have. So we could track on that, and then I will give a credit to the staff. When we discussed the segregation, we did segregation on the CFD. That was last year. They did an excellent job on that. I mean, now we having this issue. That's my main issue, being having the control of the operation. Is if we could automated that before we automated, if you could come in and test that numbers before we put it on the system. That's all I have on that.
Okay, then anybody else have a comment?
Yeah, I would like to ask a couple questions and have a comment. As I understand this, it is a draft report. Again, I'm trying to not be redundant in what's already been discussed, but we are looking at something that's addressing 7 itemized material weaknesses.
That is correct.
Including substantially the fraud program and policy. And as I'm looking back to your earlier reference to the 2016-1 notation, it was noting, this question just for curiosity, I'd like to have, if there's an answer available, fraud prevention and detection policy not implemented, meaning it doesn't exist per se as of now, but there was reference to a fraud training program on prevention that had not gone through the full employee amount. Did you find a percentage approximately of?
No,
Less
you
than
know,
that?
and that, obviously, communication comes in a lot of different ways, and you guys could focus. Employee surveys are often a good fraud preventive policy. So asking employees questions like, have you ever been asked to do something that you didn't feel comfortable with? I've taken lots of surveys like that. Have you ever felt uncomfortable with what you were doing in your day-to-day work? Do you feel like there's too much pressure? Do you have, you can do communication with employees in a lot of ways. We didn't survey the employees. We could do something like that as part of our audit process when we come in for the next year, but again, I would leave that to HR to work with you as part of council and figure out how you want to implement. In my mind, the fraud prevention program is really an HR function and not necessarily a finance function, because fraud can occur in any area in the city. And so that's why I lifted it out of the accounting policies, because it almost made it look like the finance department was responsible and this committee was responsible for fraud prevention and a program and fraud risk assessment for the whole city. No, it's really an overarching policy for the whole city. It could come in a context of operations within one of the areas within the city. You could have somebody getting a vendor kickback at an operational level that has nothing to do with finance, though finance might not have the policies in place to catch that kickback. That policy needs to be done at a much higher level, and probably some resources, I would think, deployed to it. And that's the reason I pulled it out. And so in my mind, what you've done is kind of, you've put the training in because you were in a crisis and you had a fraud, a major fraud, as any organization would do. You put some things in place, but it hasn't resonated and filtered through the whole organization. And that's a risk to you, and a risk to the city council, and a risk to management, that people are unaware of what's really been done. It hasn't been properly communicated throughout the organization, because we would find in our inquiries, because we do fraud inquiries as part of our process, we would find that people would be aware of a policy.
So as far as right now, as we look at it, though there's been some training instituted, but no official policy has been set or a program to support it, and there's no detection policy in place officially of the program.
There's a conflict of interest policy, and I believe in the financial policies, it references that. So there, and HR has one, and it's probably in your employee handbook. I mean, it's in places. The question that I have for you is, if I'm asking people if they're aware of a fraud policy and they don't know, then whatever you've put in place for communication isn't working.
So, okay, so here's the key, and I think what we're missing is this audit and this management letter deals with a time frame that's over. We can't go back and do stuff. We don't have a time machine. And so I think where we're at now is, this is what happened, this is where it's at, slightly, but the auditors were not engaged to find out what is going on today. So I think we need to deal with what happened in the past, and I would suggest that what we need to do is go back to staff and say, okay, this is what came up on the management letter, this is what needs to be resolved. Give us a list of what you see those issues as, what has been done to resolve those, and what will be done to have them resolved by the next audit, realizing that we're going to have another audit for a period that is already passed as well.
But can I ask a question about what this committee's role actually is? Because sometimes, we're Finance and Audit Committee, but sometimes I feel like we're more, could properly be named a Financial Systems, Data Review and Recommendation Committee. Because I think what we basically do is review for the city council certain documentation reports and make a recommendation to them whether they accept it or, in that matter. So we can't actually institute a policy here. This would be more for the city council, make a recommendation that they maybe address something that does not exist at this time, or enhance it or improve it. And when I'm looking at this, because we're actually not looking at an audit, I think we're looking at a report on internal controls and how it affected that audit during that time. This is just a report on the internal controls. Right. And I'm seeing that you're reporting that we have 7 material weaknesses, we have 3 significant deficiencies, and there's other matters, and you're referencing the prior year's findings. The one thing I'm not real sure on is when I see management response, is this the interpretation of your firm as to management's response during that, or is that's so in here is the management's actual response? Right. So if there's any contradictions or any I don't want to say disputes or different variations between what the findings are in internal controls and what management's response, wouldn't we just, recommend that this go to the city council because it's been established? Because I think actions would be taken after the fact in the new year rather than going back.
Right. If you remember the report that we got back in, it was voluminous of what needed to be done. And Milena and her staff gave us a list of, these are the issues, this is what we've done to fix it, this is what we will do to fix it. And we hit a point where they cleared it. And all we did with that is we got it back from the staff, we looked at it and said, hey, it looks like they've done it, it looks like what they're doing will be done. Let's recommend to the city that we believe that they've accomplished what they needed to do. And I think that's what I'm proposing of this. We're not going to tell the staff what they have to do, and we're not going to tell the city or the council what they have to do. But what we're saying is, okay, you've asked us to look at these issues, and this is what we see staff is doing to correct it. And I think that's where we're at this point.
As far as the internal controls for June 30th, 2017 ending.
That's right.
Right.
Correct.
So based upon this being an internal report on that effect from that date back, there's notation of deficiencies. It should be something that I think should be passed on to the council for their advice. And I would recommend the report to go. But as far as further implementation of policy, the fraud program of policy, yeah, it definitely needed. But would council then need to direct us back to assist in developing that policy? Or do we take that on at this point going forward?
We can make, let's just say if we chose to make a recommendation to council to accept this letter, and the responsibility is on them to vote on whether to accept it or not. But if we made that recommendation, we could make the recommendation with the added detail that the Finance and Audit Committee would like to proceed forward with tracking what these 7 major prioritized findings are, and that we would like to track that going forward like we did the state controller's report. And then I think then we've added the value, because they can't spend the time doing that in a council session. And then we've added that value, plus at that time we're comfortable too that we're not just passing something along,
right,
that we're hopefully helping to effect a better process by working with staff in our meetings to track what we're doing and how we are addressing those issues. So even if we did this recommendation to move this forward, I would not vote on that recommendation to move it forward without that caveat that we would like to do a work plan where we worked with staff on those 7 findings, because that's what I think our role is to do.
I would not be opposed to that, but I would not want to limit it to the 7 findings. I think there are other critical areas in this report that should be on that list that we develop. And I think in order to do that, I would like to have another review of this next month.
Well, I think we could do the recommendation that we'd like to go ahead with the 7 findings, with also the liberty when we get in more detail of potentially adding other details to that project plan, so that we're in as strong a position as possible at that next audit. So I agree with you, Richard, in that there may be more we want to add to it, but I think we should just leave that also in the hands of guidance by council that says, sure, go ahead and do that. We think that's a great idea. Because we actually operate under their guidance.
And we're not going to
Does that
direct,
make sense to you, Richard, or did I say that in a way that did? I think I'm agreeing with you, I'm just saying.
It sounds like it sounds like the council's dictating to the Finance Audit Committee what should be done. And
Well-
basically, we're making a recommendation to the council, and if we put those stipulations in there by prioritizing the 7 and then giving us some flexibility to look at some other areas, that would give us some latitude then to do that.
That's what I
Okay,
just
but-
said.
Well, it didn't come across
Isn't
that
that what
way.
I said?
Didn't come across that
Um,
way.
I thought that's
Anyway,
what I said.
didn't come
Okay.
across that way.
I said with the liberty to find out.
Then the council, well, anyway, no, that would be fine. That'd be fine.
yeah, we cannot dictate to the audit to change their letter. It is what it is.
Okay, I was gonna,
Yes.
can I?
And so
Oh,
I
yeah.
would like to see,
But this is a
She's got
draft.
something
Okay.
she wants to weigh in on.
So I want to just clarify that in my position today presenting the report to you, and I know you haven't had enough time to look at it, management's responses are in there. We're not going to go through and change anything unless you had heartburn tonight that you thought I categorized something inappropriately. But this is our judgment as to whether it's material weakness or significant deficiency or another matter. We're not going to change that, and the management response can be added to. I also report, I think somebody said if there was contradiction between the finding and the response. We didn't have any where we didn't agree, and I started the presentation with that, so we don't have that in this case. However, I can add to management's response if there is something that occurred factually in a meeting and that we didn't summarize it correctly here. You would report that to Milana, and then Milana would provide that feedback to me to update the report, and then we would sign a final report. We'd be ready to go final, because we're not changing the findings at this point.
Well,
And the plan would be, your internal plan would be a separate document.
so if we recommend approval, if we recommend the approval of this draft, how is it gonna come to the council as a final? It's gonna, let's say final, it's not gonna say draft?
No, it would say draft.
It'll still say draft.
It would say draft.
So you don't do a final draft, you just do draft and then the council approves and it's a done document or
It's a done document, yeah.
so
Our
Richard,
committee-
would you be comfortable making a recommendation that we recommend to the council that they accept the report on internal control, and that our committee is comfortable with that on the condition that staff work with us to create a list of the findings and track what changes have been made, what changes will need to be made, and any other information that they believe is contained in here that needs to be rectified and how they're going to do it.
I don't want to present a condition to the council, I just think we ought to say.
Well, I'm not saying that, I'm just saying that.
You said
that
condition.
We would,
Use the word condition.
okay, that we would
Basically,
recommend that,
we approve the document.
okay,
And we recommend, in recommending the approval, we recommend that the
Thank
council
you.
consider,
Thank you.
because that's their prerogative, but that the council consider allowing us to track this and set priorities on the tracking. We establish the priorities, or
Thank you.
or they can tell us what the priorities are, and we'll track it. I mean,
thank you. So can we accept that as,
Andrew has a comment too.
yes, Andrew?
I have a slight follow-on, which kind of works along the similar sort of vein. Now again, forgive me if I'm asking the wrong thing at the wrong time. I'm new to the council and the ways that you guys do this thing. I was actually here when we did the June meeting where we okayed the first thing. But on one of the handouts from the public section, thank you very much, ladies, there was a note on here that gentleman Ken Pun presented a very different set of audited financial statements with over 100 changes. Was anything that we actually looked over and okay changed? Because I was not made aware of any changes that may have been made to documents. And if we are reviewing them, as Richard says, are we going to have any method of control where we're advised of any changes to the documents through review. Because if we as a committee see something, say, I think it should be reviewed, changes are made, and we're not made aware of the changes, and then someone says, is everybody okay with the document? And we don't know that any changes have been made, we're then putting our advice behind a document that may not even be the same thing that we saw before. So 2 parts to the question. One, the thing that we originally okayed in June 4th and 5th, was there something in the region of 100 changes made to this report? Because that would be quite different from what we saw. Unless they're just things like typos, punctuation, and grammar moved around, that's one thing. I'm not fussed.
That's on item number 4. We'll be
Oh, is it?
Well,
In that case,
Yeah.
thanks
and
very much.
remember, you had 2 drafts.
Yeah.
So your first draft had no fixed assets, and your second draft had no MD&A.
Okay.
So we had to incorporate fixed assets in draft 2, and MD&A wasn't ready, and that came in draft 3. So normally, we would not have, in any normal circumstances, draft, where it's changing. But because the city was in progress of getting its fixed assets recorded and completed, we had to take the time, but we wanted to get the report in front of the audit committee early and start getting some feedback in that. Now, there are probably typos and things like that, or commas, whatever, due to time pressure to get it done.
Understood.
There are probably things like that that occur. We try to catch everything. And so we do have an agenda item coming forward for the draft of any significant changes, but generally we would report back to you if there were number changes. And that was what we reported back in the PowerPoint presentation, was when numbers changed.
So a quick follow-on to that one then.
Realize we're talking about different documents.
Yes.
A different agenda. items.
Yes.
Okay.
So follow on to then, which can also solve any possible issues of like members of the community feeling left out of the process and that things are going on behind closed doors, which, considering the history, is not a good thing. Is there any public information available as to how these changes are tracked so that the public can stay informed, so that it avoids any misunderstanding of untoward activity being conducted on any of these reports?
Well, when we had the state audit report and we put together this whole matrix thing that we did, that went on the website.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a transparency for
There was a transparency.
All right. Let's,
Everyone is a public document.
yes.
Okay.
Let's, you have a question or a
Comment.
statement?
I kind of like the idea of moving this forward with adding these in to track this, because this is done, we're already at the end of another fiscal year for another audit, so.
Okay, so will one of you put forth the proposal and
I'll move that we recommend approval of the draft document. And I want to say something about coming back to us, but maybe you 2 council members here can add in your discussions what we want to try to do as a committee.
When I'm looking at the agenda and I'm looking at other items on there, there's recommendations for approval to the city. There's no, on this agenda item, there's no action being asked of us as the committee. It's just a report from a consulting firm based upon a third-party review. And best part I can look at is it's noting deficiencies.
Yeah.
And it's basically giving us an effort to work towards to resolve those deficiencies and identifying material and other descriptions on it. I don't know that we would be approving this, but we would just recommending that it goes to we recommend that the city council review it for their consideration and for action to be taken place, and maybe with the caveat that the 7 top.
Can I try this? So we can recommend it for approval with the added information that we would like the Finance and Audit Committee to track all of the 7 items at the least going forward.
Prioritize.
Similar to the way we did the state controller's report.
Prioritize and track. I think we need that.
The prioritization is based on a set of very discrete criteria, which is the financial exposure, how widespread the risk may be, et cetera. So I think with input from our finance director, we could probably prioritize it.
That's-
I don't think we're.
No, I'd like a
people
recommendation
to
on
do the
priorities, yeah, but I'd like us to
Yeah,
receive some
okay.
recommendations.
All right, we're on the same page.
Yeah, we're-
I just feel like
Yeah.
we need that input.
Okay, so
Are
can
you
our
okay
secretary,
with that?
do you want to capsulize that, or does somebody want to say it in a motion?
No.
I'll,
Okay.
I'm happy with it.
So I make a motion that we approve the report on internal controls and the related matters identified in the audit for the fiscal year ended June 30th, 2017 to council for recommendation and with permission for the Finance and Audit Committee to track the 7 major areas of improvement that are required to report back at a later time to council on our progress.
I second that motion.
Okay, all in favor?
Is that all right? Aye.
Anybody opposed? Okay, then we'll pass that. Let's go on to the next item. And let me read this. The presentation of the governmental capital asset inventory and valuation in accordance with Government Accounting Standard Board Statement 34. And we've been asked to receive and file this. I believe you have a presentation for us.
Yes. In the room this evening is the consultant that came in and did the performance of the valuation of the assets in order to have the correct values so that we could have them included on our audited financial statement. And he's here tonight to talk about the basis of valuation, how it was determined, and how it all comes together for the audit. So I'm going to present to you Don McDougall. And at the end of his presentation, if you have questions, we will do our best to answer those.
I don't have a copy. I don't have a copy.
There's nothing for you to have a copy of.
I think
There's no copies? You all don't have a copy either?
No, we
it's
just
on the
got the letter.
screen.
It's on the screen.
Oh, my God.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for having me here today. I want to start with something off topic for a second. I don't know you folks. It's my first time meeting Ms. Burke and stuff. My job here was to bring you in line with GASB 34 compliance, to complete your infrastructure and your other assets, to clean up your existing database, and to bring you into compliance with the Government Accounting Standard Board's requirements. As of presenting this report, you are fully in compliance as of this point in time. Everything that you need's been done, everything's been documented, all of your infrastructure has been valued. Additionally, it's been valued and completed in compliance with the GASB 34 approved techniques and guidelines.
For the lies.
Continue.
It's inappropriate.
Okay.
Oh, no, this is appropriate.
No, it is not appropriate to interrupt and be rude to our guests.
Sir, may I?
Sure.
Okay.
Do you got it?
Do you understand
assets?
the concepts of libel and slander?
We need
Yes, I do. Do you understand?
Okay, we're going to take a recess, 5-minute recess.
So does my
Do you
corporate,
understand the
So does my-
concept of
5-minute recess.
so does my corporate counsel.
5-minute
Good.
recess.
Do you
If
have
you
a
go to the
list of
very,
capital assets?
do you have the PowerPoint?
Please. We're going to go back on record. And we are going to, excuse me, can we get your attention for a minute, please? Can we get your attention for a moment, please? Okay.
Richard, could you stop?
No, I don't know
Okay.
anything. You don't got
Just gonna go back
to.
on
So,
record.
you want to, do you have a job defrauding
Okay,
government?
excuse me.
No, don't
Do you
bother,
know the
just end
Delaware
it.
Crown, are you in?
They're
Okay,
not gonna be quiet.
Okay,
okay, we're going back on record.
okay.
And we are canceling the meeting. It's impossible to continue conducting the meeting because of the disruption by guests who refuse to allow our guests and our committee to function. And with that, we're
And then at
the meeting ended at 7:37 p.m.
Blame it on us.